Say they found the newborn with the umbilical cord still attached.
It was a case that shocked and stumped police. A newborn baby found dead near a flower bed in Albany's Washington Park.
For nearly 3 decades, one of Albany, New York's most heartbreaking mysteries remained unsolved. It was a case that haunted detectives, a case that survived generations of investigators, a case involving a victim so young that he never had the chance to tell anyone who he was. For 27 years, the child was known by only one name, Baby Moses. No one knew where he came from, no one knew who his parents were, and no one knew who was responsible for his death. What began as a tragic discovery in a city park would eventually become one of New York's most remarkable cold case investigations. A story of persistence, a story of science, and ultimately, a story about a child who refused to be forgotten. September 7th, 1997. The city of Albany was waking up to what seemed like an ordinary Sunday morning. Summer was beginning to fade into autumn. The weather was mild. Washington Park, one of the city's most recognizable public spaces, was quiet. Families would later walk its paths. Joggers would pass through. Children would play nearby. But early that morning, the park belonged mostly to maintenance crews preparing the grounds for another day. One city employee was carrying out routine work near a flower bed. Nothing about the task seemed unusual. Nothing suggested he was about to make a discovery that would stay with Albany for decades. Then he noticed something. At first glance, it appeared to be discarded material lying near the ground. But as he moved closer, he realized something was terribly wrong. Lying near a flower bed, close to the park's Moses statue, was the body of a newborn baby boy. Police were called immediately. Officers arrived and secured the scene. Investigators quickly understood the gravity of the situation. This wasn't merely an abandoned infant. The child was deceased. And almost immediately, detectives realized they were dealing with something far more serious. The infant had been wrapped in cloth. Some of that material showed signs of burning. Questions began forming immediately. Who was this child? How had he arrived here? Who had left him behind? And perhaps most importantly, where was his mother? As investigators worked through the scene, one fact became increasingly clear. There were very few answers. No witnesses had come forward. No one had reported seeing a woman carrying a newborn in the area. No obvious evidence pointed investigators toward a suspect. The child appeared to have arrived in the park only hours earlier, yet somehow, whoever left him there had vanished without a trace. The medical examination that followed painted an even more heartbreaking picture. Doctors determined that the infant had been born alive. More importantly, he appeared healthy. There were no serious medical complications, no natural disease, no obvious condition that would explain his death. The child weighed approximately 9 pounds and 3 ounces. By every indication, he had entered the world with every opportunity to live. Instead, his life lasted less than 12 hours. For investigators, that realization transformed the case. This was no longer a question of identifying an abandoned infant. This was now a homicide investigation. And yet detectives faced a challenge unlike almost any other. They didn't know the victim's name. Think about that for a moment. In most homicide investigations, police begin with the victim. Who was this person? Where did they live? Who knew them? Who might have wanted to harm them? Those questions create investigative leads. But in this case, investigators couldn't even answer the most basic question. Who was the child? Without an identity, every avenue became more difficult. No family members could be interviewed. No friends could be questioned. No background could be examined. The victim was completely unknown, and so was the person responsible. As news of the discovery spread throughout Albany, the community reacted with shock. Residents struggled to understand how something like this could happen. Many couldn't stop thinking about the baby. Others wondered whether the mother might still be nearby. Some hoped there had been a misunderstanding, but investigators knew otherwise. The medical findings were clear. This child had been born alive, and now he was gone. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Detectives pursued every lead available. They examined hospital records. They searched for women who may have recently given birth. They followed tips from the public. They interviewed potential witnesses. They reviewed evidence repeatedly. Nothing worked. The mystery remained intact. The infant's identity remained unknown, and the case slowly began evolving into one of Albany's most painful unsolved investigations. Yet something extraordinary happened during those early years. Rather than allowing the child to disappear into obscurity, the city made a decision. A deeply human decision. The infant would not remain forgotten. the child had been discovered near the Moses statue in Washington Park. The symbolism was difficult to ignore. According to biblical tradition, Moses himself had once been an abandoned infant, discovered by strangers. Because of that connection, investigators and community members began referring to the child as Baby Moses. The name stayed. Over time, it became much more than a nickname. It became his identity, at least until his real identity could be discovered. Years passed. The case remained unsolved. Yet Baby Moses continued to occupy a place in Albany's collective memory. Residents remembered, detectives remembered, city officials remembered, and eventually, the city arranged for the infant to receive a proper burial. He was laid to rest in Graceland Cemetery. There, a headstone was placed. The inscription was simple, yet incredibly powerful. Moses Washington, citizen of Albany, child of God. Most homicide victims are mourned by family, parents, siblings, friends, loved ones. Baby Moses had none of those people standing publicly beside his grave. At least none that investigators knew about. Instead, he was mourned by an entire city. People who had never met him, people who never knew his real name, people who simply believed he deserved dignity. That decision would later become one of the most emotional elements of the entire case, because even though investigators couldn't identify him, they refused to let him become anonymous. For many detectives, that commitment became personal. As years passed, officers retired. New investigators joined the department. Case files changed hands. Technology evolved. The world transformed around them. But Baby Moses remained, his photograph remained, his file remained, his grave remained, and every so often someone would pull the file from storage and look again. Could something have been missed? Could a detail have been overlooked? Could a fresh set of eyes finally uncover the answer? Unfortunately, the answer remained the same. No breakthrough, no suspect, no identity, nothing. As the years stretched into decades, many cold cases simply faded away. Witnesses disappeared, evidence degraded. Memories became unreliable. Investigative opportunities vanished. But something about Baby Moses prevented that from happening. Perhaps it was the age of the victim. Perhaps it was the complete absence of answers. Or perhaps it was the simple fact that every detective who encountered the case felt the same responsibility. This child deserved justice. Even if that justice took years. Even if it took decades. The original investigators never stopped believing the case could be solved. And in hindsight, one decision they made would prove absolutely critical: evidence preservation. Back in 1997, DNA technology looked very different from what it does today. Investigators could not possibly predict the future. They couldn't know that entirely new forensic techniques would emerge. They couldn't know that genetic genealogy would someday transform criminal investigations. Yet they preserved evidence carefully. They protected it. They stored it. And because of that decision, the possibility of solving the case remained alive. At the time, nobody realized just how important that choice would become. Because while investigators struggled through the late 1990s and early 2000s, a scientific revolution was quietly taking shape. Across America, forensic technology was advancing rapidly. Cases once considered impossible were suddenly becoming solvable. Cold cases decades old were being reopened. Unknown victims were being identified. Hidden family connections were being uncovered. And somewhere in Albany, inside an evidence room, Baby Moses was waiting. Waiting for science to catch up. Waiting for technology to evolve. Waiting for someone to discover what investigators in 1997 could never have imagined. Because after more than 20 years without answers, the case was about to enter an entirely new chapter. A chapter that would change everything, and ultimately lead investigators to the answer they had been searching for since that September morning in Washington Park. But first, they would need to take another look at a case many people believed could never be solved. By the time the calendar turned to 2020, the Baby Moses case had been unsolved for more than 22 years. An entire generation had grown up. Children born in 1997 were now adults. Investigators who had worked the original case had retired. Some had spent years wondering whether they would ever learn the truth. Yet despite the passage of time, Baby Moses had never completely disappeared from Albany's memory. His grave remained. His story remained. And inside police archives, so did the evidence. For most cold cases, time is the enemy. Every year makes an investigation more difficult. Witnesses move away. Records disappear. Memories become unreliable. Physical evidence deteriorates. Eventually, many cases reach a point where detectives simply run out of options. Baby Moses should have been one of those cases. But it wasn't. Because while the case itself remained frozen in time, Forensic science was evolving faster than anyone could have imagined. Throughout the early 2000s and 2010s, DNA technology transformed criminal investigations across the United States. Cases once considered impossible suddenly became solvable. Unknown victims were identified. Decades-old murders were linked to suspects. Families finally received answers after years of uncertainty. And perhaps most importantly, a revolutionary technique known as forensic genetic genealogy began changing everything. Most people are familiar with DNA evidence, but genetic genealogy works differently. Instead of searching for a suspect directly, investigators search for relatives, even distant relatives, a cousin, a second cousin, someone connected through a family tree. Those connections can eventually lead detectives toward an unknown individual. The technique had already generated national headlines. Cases that had remained unsolved for decades were suddenly producing arrests. Investigators everywhere were paying attention, including those in Albany. In 2020, the Albany Police Department made a decision. Rather than allowing baby Moses to remain buried inside an old case file, they would try again. The department partnered with the Cold Case Analysis Center at the College of St. Rose. The project brought together law enforcement professionals and academic researchers. Their mission was simple: review the case from the beginning, look at every detail, challenge old assumptions, and determine whether modern science could uncover something investigators in 1997 never had access to. It was a significant turning point. For the first time in years, there was renewed momentum. Fresh eyes examined the evidence. Fresh minds evaluated the investigation. And perhaps most importantly, new technology became available. As researchers reviewed the case, one fact became increasingly important. The original investigators had preserved biological evidence. That decision, made more than 2 decades earlier, suddenly became the foundation of everything that followed. Without preserved evidence, no modern DNA testing would be possible. Without preserved evidence, there would be no genealogy investigation. Without preserved evidence, baby Moses might have remained unidentified forever. But the evidence existed, and that meant there was still hope. As work continued, investigators turned to a company called Othram. For many viewers, this may be the first time hearing that name. But within the world of forensic science, Othram has become known for tackling some of the most difficult identification cases in the country. Their specialty is working with degraded and challenging DNA samples, the kind of evidence traditional methods sometimes struggle to analyze. And baby Moses represented exactly that kind of challenge. The evidence was more than 20 years old. Time had not been kind to it. Yet scientists believed they could still extract valuable genetic information. The process took time. There were no guarantees. No one knew whether the sample would produce useful results. But eventually, the breakthrough arrived. Scientists successfully developed a forensic genetic profile. For the first time since 1997, investigators possessed something entirely new, a path forward. Not a suspect, not a confession, not an arrest, but a genetic roadmap. And sometimes that's all an investigation needs. The profile was then provided to specialists involved in forensic genetic genealogy, including experts working alongside the FBI. This stage of the investigation was unlike anything detectives in 1997 could have imagined. Instead of searching for fingerprints, instead of waiting for tips, instead of conducting traditional interviews, investigators were now searching through family connections hidden inside DNA. The process is remarkably complex. A genetic profile is compared against genealogy databases. Potential relatives are identified. Family trees are constructed. Connections are mapped. Generations are traced, piece by piece. Investigators attempt to determine where an unknown person fits within a larger family network. It's part science, part history, part detective work. And in the baby Moses investigation, it finally produced something valuable. A relative. Not the mother. Not a suspect, just a relative. But after 23 years without answers, even that represented enormous progress. For the first time, investigators had a human connection, a thread leading back toward the truth. The family tree expanded. Researchers followed branch after branch. Names emerged. Relationships were examined. Dates were compared. Locations were analyzed. Slowly, a picture began forming. Investigators narrowed their focus. Certain possibilities were eliminated. Others became increasingly important. The process required patience. One mistake could send detectives in the wrong direction. One incorrect assumption could waste months of work. So investigators moved carefully, methodically, following the evidence wherever it led. Eventually, That evidence pointed toward a woman named Carrie Mazuka. The discovery represented the most significant breakthrough in the case's history. Yet detectives understood something important. A theory is not proof. Even if genealogy strongly suggested a connection, investigators still needed evidence capable of surviving scrutiny in court. DNA genealogy can generate leads, but those leads must be confirmed. That meant more work remained. Much more. Rather than rushing toward an arrest, investigators continued building the case. Surveillance was conducted. Additional evidence was collected. Every step had to be documented. Every conclusion had to be supported. The investigation had already lasted more than 2 decades. There was no reason to rush now. The priority was accuracy. Eventually, detectives moved to the next critical phase, obtaining a confirmatory DNA sample. According to reporting on the case, investigators collected discarded items associated with Mazuka. The strategy is commonly used in criminal investigations. When people throw away items, those objects may contain biological material. That material can sometimes provide a DNA sample. Investigators submitted the sample for testing. Then they waited. The results would determine whether years of genealogy work had led them in the right direction. If the DNA matched, the case would take a dramatic step forward. If it didn't, investigators might find themselves back at the beginning. The stakes were enormous. Then the answer arrived. The DNA matched. The biological connection was confirmed. After more than 20 years, detectives finally knew who baby Moses' mother was. The breakthrough was extraordinary. For decades, investigators hadn't even known the child's identity. Now they knew something far more significant. They knew where he came from. They knew whose DNA he carried. And they knew exactly where their investigation needed to go next. Yet despite the significance of the discovery, the case was not over. Far from it. In many ways, the investigation was entering its most important stage. Because identifying a person and proving a crime are 2 very different things. Detectives still needed answers. They still needed statements. They still needed to understand what had happened in September 1997. The DNA evidence had solved one mystery, but another remained. For 27 years, investigators had wondered what happened during the final hours of baby Moses' life. Now they were finally close enough to ask. As detectives prepared for the next phase of the investigation, something remarkable became clear. The case had survived long enough for technology to solve a problem that once seemed impossible. The original detectives could never have imagined genetic genealogy. They could never have predicted modern DNA profiling. They could never have known that evidence preserved in 1997 would one day reveal the truth. Yet because they protected that evidence, future investigators were given an opportunity, and they made the most of it. The child who had spent decades without an identity was no longer anonymous. The mystery that had haunted Albany for nearly 3 decades was finally beginning to unravel. But the most dramatic chapter was still ahead. Because soon, detectives would sit down face to face with the woman they believed held the answers. And after 27 years of silence, the baby Moses case was about to hear a confession. One that would finally explain what happened on that September morning in 1997, and bring one of Albany's longest-running mysteries to its conclusion. For nearly 27 years, the baby Moses investigation had existed in a strange place. Detectives knew a crime had occurred. They knew a healthy newborn baby had died. They knew someone was responsible, but they didn't know who. Now, for the first time since September 1997, that was changing. Years of investigative work, years of preserved evidence, years of technological advancement, all of it had led investigators to a single person, Carrie Mazuka. The DNA evidence had provided a biological connection. The genealogy research had identified a family line. The investigation had narrowed its focus. Now detectives needed something more. They needed answers. And so, after nearly 3 decades, investigators prepared for one of the most important interviews in Albany Police Department history. The date was September 6, 2024. The timing was remarkable. Almost exactly 27 years after baby Moses had been found in Washington Park. For detectives who had spent years chasing the truth, the moment must have felt surreal. The case had outlasted careers. It had survived generations of investigators. And now, finally, there was an opportunity to learn what happened. During the interview, according to investigators and court records, Mazuka confessed. For the first time, detectives heard an explanation directly from the person they believed was responsible. The confession brought an end to one of the central mysteries of the case. For decades, investigators had relied on physical evidence, medical findings, forensic analysis, theories built from facts. Now they had an admission, an acknowledgement from the person at the center of the investigation. For many cases, a confession marks the end. But for baby Moses, it represented something deeper. It represented the end of uncertainty, the end of wondering whether answers would ever come, the end of 27 years without resolution. The following days brought dramatic developments. News of the investigation spread quickly. Local residents learned that an arrest had finally been made. People who remembered the original case were stunned. Many had spent years assuming the mystery would never be solved. Some had followed every update. Others remembered seeing stories about baby Moses decades earlier. Now, after nearly 30 years, they were learning that the case had finally been broken. On September 16, 2024, Mazuka was formally arrested. She was charged in connection with the death of baby Moses. The announcement generated headlines throughout the region. Law enforcement officials held press conferences. Investigators explained the role of forensic genealogy. Reporters revisited the history of the case. And once again, Albany found itself discussing a child it had never forgotten. One of the most heartbreaking revelations involved the infant's biological father. During the investigation, detectives located and interviewed him. According to reporting on the case, he stated that he had never known about the pregnancy. He did not know a child existed. He never knew he had become a father. And he never had the opportunity to know his son. It's difficult to imagine learning something like that decades later. To discover that a child once existed. To discover that child's life ended before it truly began. And to discover that 27 years had already passed. The revelation added another emotional dimension to an already tragic story. As the legal process moved forward, prosecutors began preparing their case. The evidence was extensive. DNA evidence, genealogy research, investigative findings, and now, according to authorities, a confession. The case that had once seemed impossible to solve suddenly appeared remarkably strong. Yet legal proceedings often involve negotiations, discussions between prosecutors and defense attorneys, considerations about evidence, considerations about outcomes, and eventually, those discussions led to a plea agreement. In February 2025, Mazuka entered a guilty plea. The plea represented a major moment in the case. For investigators, it meant the years of work had achieved a formal legal acknowledgement. For prosecutors, it meant accountability. For the community, it meant the mystery was finally over. And for baby Moses, it meant the justice system had reached a conclusion. Still, sentencing remained. The final chapter had not yet been written. As April 2025 approached, attention turned toward the upcoming hearing. It would be the last major event in a story that had begun nearly 3 decades earlier. For many people, sentencing hearings can seem procedural, technical, predictable. But this hearing carried unusual emotional weight. The victim had waited 27 years. The city had waited 27 years. Former detectives had waited 27 years. Now everyone would finally hear how the court intended to resolve the case. On April 18, 2025, the sentencing hearing took place. Inside the courtroom, decades of history seemed to converge. The original crime, the long investigation, the DNA breakthrough, the confession. All of it led to this moment. Mazuka addressed the court. According to reports, she apologized. She described her actions as horrible and unimaginable. She expressed remorse. Yet the hearing also revealed a striking contrast in perspectives. At one point, Mazuka described herself as a good mother and a law-abiding person. She asked the court for leniency. The prosecution viewed the situation differently. Assistant District Attorney Jessica Blaine Lewis presented arguments emphasizing accountability. A probation report was discussed. The prosecution argued that alternatives had existed, that choices had been available, and that responsibility could not be avoided. The contrast between those positions created one of the most dramatic moments of the entire legal process. Two very different interpretations of the same events, two very different perspectives on responsibility. Ultimately, the decision belonged to the judge. And when that decision came, it was clear. The court imposed the maximum sentence available under the plea agreement. 25 years in state prison, 5 years of post-release supervision. For many observers, the sentence marked the official conclusion of the case. Legally speaking, that was true. The investigation was complete. The court process was complete. The mystery had been solved. But in another sense, the story wasn't really about the sentence. It never had been. Because when people remember the baby Moses case, they rarely begin with the offender. They begin with the child. And perhaps that's exactly how it should be. After all, baby Moses was the reason investigators never gave up. He was the reason evidence remained preserved. He was the reason researchers reopened the file. He was the reason scientists spent years developing new techniques. Everything ultimately came back to him, a child who never had the opportunity to speak for himself, yet somehow inspired decades of people to speak on his behalf. One of the most powerful aspects of the story is the number of individuals who contributed to solving it. Think about how many people became part of this journey. The city worker who made the discovery, the first responding officers, the medical professionals who examined the evidence, the detectives who worked the original investigation, the investigators who inherited the case years later, the researchers at the College of St. Rose, the forensic scientists at Othram, the FBI genealogy specialists, the prosecutors, the judges. Each person carried the case forward. Some worked on it for days. Others worked on it for years. Some retired before the case was solved. Yet all of them contributed. Few investigations illustrate teamwork on this scale, and perhaps that's why the case resonates so strongly. Because it demonstrates something important about justice. Justice is rarely the result of a single breakthrough. It's usually the result of persistence. One person preserving evidence, another person reviewing a file, another person testing a sample, another person refusing to quit. Eventually, those efforts add up, and sometimes they produce answers. The baby Moses investigation also demonstrates something remarkable about modern science. When the child was discovered in 1997, forensic genetic genealogy did not exist. The technology wasn't available. The investigators couldn't use it because nobody had invented it yet. Yet they still preserved evidence. They still believed future investigators might have tools they didn't. That foresight changed everything. Without preserved evidence, there would be no DNA profile. Without a DNA profile, there would be no genealogy search. Without genealogy, there would be no identification. And without identification, the case might still be unsolved today. The story therefore becomes more than a cold case. It becomes a lesson in patience, a lesson in preparation, and a lesson in why unsolved cases should never be abandoned. Because no one knows what future technology might reveal. No one knows which breakthrough may be waiting just around the corner. For Albany, that breakthrough finally arrived.
Say they found the
And when it
newborn with
did,
the umbilical
it
cord still
transformed a
attached.
mystery
It
into
was a case
solved
that shocked and
But perhaps the
stumped
most emotional
police.
part of the
A
story
newborn
can
baby
be found
found
far
dead
away
near a
from police
flower bed in
headquarters,
Albany's Washington
far
Park.
away from laboratories, far away from courtrooms. It can be found in a cemetery. At Graceland Cemetery sits a simple headstone. For years it represented a child whose identity was unknown, a child whose story remained unfinished, a child remembered only as baby Moses. Yet even before investigators solved the case, the city had already decided something important. This child mattered. He deserved a name. He deserved dignity. He deserved to be remembered. The inscription remains one of the most moving elements of the entire case. Moses Washington, citizen of Albany, child of God. For 27 years, those words stood as a promise that the child would not be forgotten, a promise that someone still cared, a promise that his story mattered. And in the end, that promise was kept. The mystery was solved. The questions were answered. The investigation was completed. But perhaps the greatest achievement was something much simpler. A child who entered the world without a voice was finally heard. A child who spent decades without answers finally received them. And a child who once had no name became one of the most remembered victims in Albany's history. For 27 years, baby Moses was a mystery. Today, he is something else. A reminder of persistence, a reminder of justice, and proof that even the coldest cases can eventually find their answers, as long as someone is willing to keep looking.